no demonstration at all in the streets.
Here's why this matters to us.
After months on the run, Muammar Gaddafi is dead.
October 2011. The world was watching history unfold. Libya was free. Another dictator gone. The people are liberated. A huge victory for democracy. At least, that's what we were told.
This is a momentous day in the history of Libya. The dark shadow of tyranny has been lifted, and with this enormous promise, the Libyan people now have a great responsibility to build an inclusive and tolerant and democratic Libya that stands as the ultimate rebuke to Gaddafi's dictatorship.
But now, here's the thing. About 14 years later, Libya isn't this thriving democracy. It's not even a functioning country. Instead, it's a fractured mess. Militias fighting for power, migrant slave markets, foreign mercenaries. The place is unrecognizable. So, what happened? I want to tell you the story of how the US and its NATO allies stole the future of Libya. I'll show you the geopolitical motivations behind the intervention that toppled Gaddafi's government 14 years ago, and how a single lapse in judgment by the then US President Barack Obama led to the nation turning on itself, with different warlords battling for control over the fourth largest country in Africa. This story doesn't just end with Libya, as the situation in the country has since brought back slave markets on the continent of Africa. There are factional leaders also engaging in arms smuggling activities, leading to a wider insecurity situation in the Sahel countries.
We came, we saw, he died.
To understand the story of Libya and the series of activities that led to its fall, we need to go back in time to the colonial era. For over a century, Libya was a loose collection of regions tightly controlled by the Ottoman Empire. There was Tripolitania in the west, Cyrenaica in the east, and Fezzan in the south. This region was a crucial piece of the puzzle in North African trade routes, mostly because of its strategic location along the Mediterranean Sea. But the Ottomans weren't the last to rule over Libya. That title would soon belong to a European empire looking to expand its reach. Here comes Italy.
The King of Italy, on his visit to Libya, was received by Marshal Balbo, the young, bearded and popular governor.
In 1911, Italy invaded, claiming it was their destiny to now control Libya, branding it as their own piece of New Rome. It didn't matter that people were already living there. Over the next few decades, the Italians turned Libya into a settler colony, displacing the local population to make room for thousands of Italian migrants. The indigenous people, especially the Bedouins, resisted, and that's where a name enters our story: Omar Mukhtar. This guy, Omar Mukhtar, also known as the Lion of the Desert, led a resistance movement against the Italians. His forces waged guerrilla warfare in the deserts of Cyrenaica for nearly 2 decades. He became a symbol of Libyan resistance until he was captured and executed in 1931. But even in death, his legacy remained. After Mukhtar's death, the Italian regime under Mussolini cracked down hard. Entire Libyan communities were forced into concentration camps where tens of thousands died from disease and starvation. The dream of independence seemed impossible. But as history would have it, Italy wasn't destined to hold on to Libya forever. Enters World War II.
The sands of Egypt, the British 8th Army prepares for what history will record as the 7th Battle of Libya.
Libya became a battleground between Axis and Allied forces. The Italian and German armies fought against the British and Free French, turning Libya into a war zone. Cities were bombed and entire communities were caught in the crossfire. But when the dust finally settled, Italy was gone. The Allies had won, but winning the war didn't mean Libya was free. Its future was merely up for grabs by yet another superpower. The question now was, who would control it? The British soon took control of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. The French occupied Fezzan. Some wanted Libya to be split among these new rulers. Others simply wanted it to be an independent nation. So in 1949, something historic happened. The United Nations got involved, and after lots of backroom deals, a resolution was passed to make Libya the first African country to gain its independence. But the process wasn't immediate. On December 24, 1951, 2 years after the UN resolution, Libya officially became an independent kingdom led by King Idris, a man from the powerful Sanusi religious order in Cyrenaica. He was seen as a unifier, a monarch who would hold this divided land together. But there was just this one major problem. Libya, you see, was one of the poorest countries in the world. Its economy was weak and there were almost no real sources of income. The country needed something, anything, to survive. And then they found it.
Esso Standard Libya was the first company to find oil there.
In 1959, 8 years after its freedom from colonial rule, everything changed. Libya discovered oil, and not just some oil, a lot of it. With that, Libya went from being a poor desert kingdom, dependent on international aid and rent from US and British air bases, to an oil-rich monarchy. Suddenly, the game had changed. Western companies started flooding in, eager to tap into this new wealth found in the desert. This oil wealth meant the government now had a truckload of money to spend. They embarked on massive construction projects, trying to improve the quality of life for Libyans. But as the economic standard improved, so did the cost of living. And there was also this small matter of corruption. The new King Idris struggled to maintain control, and not everyone was happy with how Libya's newfound wealth was being handled. The king's pro-Western positions in international affairs also was becoming a huge problem back at home. By the late 1960s, discontent was growing. King Idris continued to allow foreign companies to exploit Libya's oil. His fondness for the West was becoming more and more of an issue, especially when he failed to speak out against Israel during the June War of 1967. Meanwhile, a new wave of Arab nationalism was sweeping across the Middle East. Egypt had Nasser, Iraq had its own revolution, and in Libya, there was a young military officer watching all of this very closely and taking notes. His name, Muammar Gaddafi. In 1963, Gaddafi joined the Libyan military academy. Quietly and carefully, he assembled a loyal group of young officers who shared his radical views, plotting meticulously for years. From a young age, he admired revolutionaries, figures like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. His inspiration was Arab nationalism. He dreamed of throwing off foreign influence and making Libya truly independent and powerful. By September 1969, while King Idris was away in Turkey for a medical treatment, Gaddafi saw his chance and he took it. In one night, Libya went from monarchy to military rule. Immediately after taking power, Gaddafi rebranded Libya. It became the Libyan Arab Republic, a new revolutionary state. Soon after, he wrote this weird political manifesto called the Green Book, outlining a unique form of governance, blending socialism, pan-Arabism, and Islamic values. By 1977, the country's name changed yet again to the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahirila. Such a long name, I know, but this simply meant government through the masses. One of Gaddafi's earliest and boldest moves was seizing control of Libya's vast oil resources. Before him, foreign corporations dominated Libyan oil. Gaddafi changed the game. He expelled Western military bases and boldly renegotiated contracts with foreign companies. When they resisted, he threatened nationalization, eventually forcing them into accepting Libyan terms. This move drastically increased Libya's oil revenue, and in a matter of years, Libya was transformed into one of Africa's richest countries per capita. The country had the highest living standards in Africa. There was free healthcare, free education, and government-funded housing. As the country prospered, he introduced policies that he thought would protect his people against the evils of capitalism. He banned renting houses for profit, declaring that every Libyan had the right to own their home and forbidding commercial property rentals. While these principles sounded noble, it caused chaos and housing shortages, stunting real estate development in the process. However, Gaddafi was not just focused on building Libya in his own image. He was busy on the international stage too. By the 1980s, Gaddafi wasn't satisfied with Libya alone. He envisioned himself as Africa's liberator and leader. He dreamed of a United States of Africa, a continent free from Western influence. He showered money and resources onto other African leaders, trying to win over their loyalty. This extravagant generosity and charisma earned him influence across the continent. Throughout this period, Gaddafi sought to control the mineral-rich Alzo Strip along the disputed border with neighboring Chad. However, when he invaded, Chad, backed by France, resisted fiercely. After years of brutal desert warfare, Libya was eventually defeated and forced to withdraw. This was such an embarrassing defeat for Gaddafi's regional ambitions. By the late 70s and 80s, Gaddafi's reputation was darkening. His anti-Western rhetoric and flamboyant, provocative lifestyle made him a much disliked figure in the West. Ronald Reagan, former US president, famously labeled him the mad dog of the Middle East. But this wasn't a mere rhetoric. Libya's relationship with the United States, which had been an important trading partner, deteriorated in the early 80s as the US government increasingly protested Gaddafi's alleged support of Palestinian Arab militants. Gaddafi was accused of actively funding and supporting terrorist organizations globally, from the IRA in Ireland to Abu Nida's Palestinian group. There were a series of retaliatory trade restrictions between both countries when tensions escalated in the mid-1980s. The tensions boiled over, culminating in US bombing raid of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, in which Gaddafi's adopted daughter was killed. 2 years later, in 1988, Pan AM Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. Gaddafi was directly implicated. Sanctions and international isolation followed. Libya became an international pariah state. But the tensions didn't die down. Feeling increasingly threatened by the West and inspired by Pakistan's nuclear breakthrough, Gaddafi secretly pursued nuclear weapons throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. He bought nuclear technology from Abdul Qadir Khan, a Pakistani scientist, determined to strengthen Libya's military capabilities. But international intelligence intercepted these plans. After several years of intense pressure from the West, Gaddafi dramatically abandoned Libya's nuclear program, agreeing to dismantle his entire nuclear infrastructure. In the late 1990s, in an effort to win over the international community, Libya turned over the alleged perpetrators of the Pan AM Flight 103 bombing to international authorities. Gaddafi also accepted a ruling by the International Court in The Hague stating that the contested Alzo territory along the border with Chad belonged to that country and not to Libya. After abandoning his nuclear programs, the United Kingdom restored diplomatic relations with Libya at the end of the decade, with UN sanctions also lifted in 2003. Suddenly, Gaddafi began collaborating with Western intelligence agencies against terrorism. Once fierce enemies, Western leaders flocked to Tripoli. British Prime Minister Tony Blair famously shook hands with Gaddafi in a tent in the Libyan desert. International oil companies eagerly returned, signing lucrative new contracts. Gaddafi was back in the fold. As Gaddafi rebuilt his personal image abroad, he was also building his personal fortune. While publicly preaching socialism and simplicity, privately, Gaddafi and his family enjoyed lavish overseas lifestyles, amassed billions in hidden foreign accounts, owned extravagant villas, yachts, and expensive art collections. With political freedom far from being a reality, people started to grumble. Dissidents faced imprisonment or death. Public executions were common at the time. So, when the Arab Spring hit in 2011 and people started rising up against their governments, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Libya was next. Protests broke out, and Gaddafi, well, he responded in the worst possible way. At this point, the world starts paying attention. The UN steps in, and suddenly NATO gets involved. And this is where things get complicated. March 2011, the UN passes Resolution 1973. It gives NATO the green light to intervene in Libya, officially to stop a humanitarian crisis. Gaddafi's forces were closing in on Benghazi, and people feared a massacre. The world had already failed to stop genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, so this time they acted fast.
The United States has worked with our international partners to mobilize a broad coalition secure an international mandate to protect civilians, stop an advancing army, prevent a massacre, and establish a no-fly zone with our allies and partners.
And just like that, NATO was at war, bombing Gaddafi's military, enforcing a no-fly zone, helping rebels take back cities. Within just a few months, the regime was collapsing. But something was not right here. The official rationale given by the US, NATO and the United Nations was humanitarian, to stop Gaddafi from massacring his own people. UN Security Council Resolution 1973, adopted in March 2011, authorized all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians. In fact, President Barack Obama emphasized that the goal was not regime change or long-term occupation, but to prevent a humanitarian disaster.
But broadening our military mission to include regime change would be a mistake.
NATO's mandate was to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack, and this was plausible. Gaddafi is already known to have a notorious human rights record. So, when he vowed to show no mercy to rebels in Benghazi, world leaders cited the responsibility to protect, known as R2P doctrine, to justify military action. Obama described how every moment mattered as Gaddafi's forces neared Benghazi, and said he did not want to see America stand by silently as a brutal dictator announced his intentions to kill en masse. According to what NATO was telling the world, this intervention was a moral obligation, one they must abide by to save lives and support Libya's democratic aspirations. But there was more. Beneath the rhetoric, there were more cynical motives at play. Libya, you see, is an oil-rich country strategically located in North Africa, and Gaddafi had proven himself to be an unpredictable leader. There were in fact internal communications hinting at economic and political incentives behind NATO's decision to get involved. The 2011 memo to the US Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, suggested that France's President Nicolas Sarkozy was driven by, quote, a cocktail of less lofty incentives, including a desire for Libyan oil and a fear that Gaddafi's vast supply of gold could displace France's primacy in the region, end of quote. According to this intelligence briefing, France's motives for pushing the intervention included increasing its share of Libya's oil, bolstering French influence in Africa, and improving Sarkozy's domestic standing. Some observers also noted that NATO's intervention was influenced by a desire to reassert Western influence in the region during the Arab Spring, secure access to Libya's resources, and prevent Gaddafi from undermining Western allied African financial systems. So, while Barack Obama, David Cameron, and Nicolas Sarkozy continued to preach the moral obligation message, there was more going on behind the scenes. The Arab League's unusual request for a no-fly zone over Libya provided political cover, since regional support implied the intervention was not simply a Western imposition. Countries like Qatar and the UAE joined the NATO-led coalition, indicating Gulf Arab rivals also sought Gaddafi's removal. Yeah, he made a lot of enemies, and now that there was blood in the water, the sharks began circling.
It appeared to be the heaviest bombardment of Libya's capital since NATO air attacks began. More than 20 strikes in and around Tripoli lit up the sky, and the booms could be heard across the city.
On March 19, 2011, a US-led coalition launched Operation Odyssey Down, initiating airstrikes against Libyan government forces. French fighter jets were the first in action, dramatically disabling a loyalist armored column outside Benghazi and effectively stopping Gaddafi's advance. The initial phase saw the United States, France, and Britain heavily involved in suppressing Libya's air defenses and armor. Shortly thereafter, NATO took over command of the operation. On March 31, 2011, Operation Unified Protector formally put NATO in charge of the air campaign and naval blockade, with command centers in Italy coordinating missions. The Libyan campaign was characterized by an unusual US approach. The Obama administration, wary of another Iraq-style entanglement, decided the US would support the mission but not take the forefront in a prolonged war. Washington provided critical assets in the opening days: cruise missile strikes, electronic jamming, intelligence, drones, and area refueling to disable Gaddafi's forces, then handed primary responsibility to NATO allies. President Obama described this strategy as aligning US power with an international coalition so that America was not bearing all the burden. In practical terms, the US role after the first week was mostly supportive. American drones patrolled Libyan skies and US aircraft struck targets as needed. But European NATO members carried out the bulk of bombing runs after April 2011. France and Britain were the public faces, with NATO providing a unified command that included contributions from smaller nations. A total of 18 countries eventually participated militarily, including Canada, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and even 3 Arab states. Those were Jordan, Qatar, and the UAE, which sent fighter jets or support aircraft. Over the 7-month operation, NATO flew more than 26,500 sorties, including around 9,700 strike missions hitting thousands of targets. Notably, no NATO ground troops were deployed in Libya. Special forces from some countries such as British and French advisors and Qatari units did reportedly assist Libyan rebel forces on the ground, but officially, NATO relied solely on air power and naval support. This air power only approach was effective in the short term. It grounded Gaddafi's air force and methodically destroyed his heavy weaponry, leveling a battlefield for the lightly armed rebels. By August 2011, rebels with NATO air cover advanced into Tripoli and Gaddafi's rule collapsed. The immediate military outcome seemed like a success for NATO. There were 0 combat casualties on the NATO side, and by October, the Libyan rebels had effectively won the civil war. And on October 20, 2011, Gaddafi, who had fled the capital and hid in his hometown of Sirte, was found by the rebel group. They dragged him through the streets and brutally murdered him, all while making videos. Finally, the mad dog is dead. The world celebrates. Libya is free. Mission accomplished, right? Well, not exactly. Here is where everything falls apart. The moment Gaddafi is gone, Libya has no central government, no institutions, no army. Just a bunch of militias with weapons. And soon, they start fighting for power, for land, for oil. In the weeks following Gaddafi's fall, Libya's interim authorities, the National Transitional Council, took power amid great optimism. Oil exports, which had halted during the war, resumed. NATO countries and the UN recognized the new leadership. However, beneath the hopeful surface, warning signs appeared almost immediately. The way NATO executed its intervention meant no peacekeeping force was deployed, and the rebels who fought Gaddafi did not disarm. Dozens of militias controlled different patches of territory, including the capital. Many arms depots had been looted. The new authorities had little control over the countless fighters energized by victory. In October 2011, as celebratory gunfire faded, reports emerged of score settling and human rights abuses. For example, reprisals against suspected pro-Gaddafi loyalists and sub-Saharan African migrant workers, many of whom were accused of being mercenaries. Over the next few years, Libya becomes a battlefield. 2 rival governments emerge. Then ISIS shows up. Then foreign mercenaries. Russia, Turkey, the UAE, Egypt, everyone starts picking sides. And suddenly, Libya isn't just a failed state, it's a full-blown war zone. Now, here's the part no one talks about much. After the war that removed Gaddafi, Libya became the epicenter of human trafficking. Migrants from Africa trying to reach Europe get trapped in Libya. Many are sold into slavery. Yeah, actual modern-day slave markets. In 2017, CNN uncovered footage of people being auctioned off in Tripoli. And the world, it just moved on. But humans are not the only commodities being trafficked in Libya. Smuggling networks have flourished amid the anarchy. Weapons looted from Gaddafi's armory spread across an entire region already plagued with instability. In early 2013, a UN report warned that arms were being smuggled from Libya at an alarming rate, fueling conflicts in Mali, Syria, and beyond. Militant groups capitalized on the thousands of Libyan weapons and everything from small arms to anti-aircraft missiles to strengthen their insurgencies. For example, in 2012, battle-hardened fighters, including Tuareg ethnic fighters who had served in Gaddafi's forces, returned to Mali with heavy weaponry, sparking a rebellion in Mali's north that led to an Islamist takeover of that region, before a French intervention known as Operation Sahel in 2013 drove them back. The Sahel region as a whole saw a surge in violence traceable to Libya's collapse. In Egypt's Sinai and in Gaza, militants also reportedly received arms from Libyan stockpiles. Internally, Libya itself became a haven for extremist groups. By 2014, jihadist organizations like Ansar al-Sharia and the Islamic State, ISIS, had established a foothold amid the disorder. And there have been proxy warfare in the country of late. In the absence of a central authority, Libya became an arena for regional and global powers to settle scores and vie for influence. During the Second Civil War, which started in 2014 and continued until 2020, foreign nations backed different Libyan factions with money, weapons, and fighters. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates supported General Haftar's eastern forces, seeing him as a bulwark against Islamists and aligning with their broader opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood across the region. Turkey and Qatar, on the other hand, supported the Western factions in Tripoli, which included Islamist-leaning groups in line with their foreign policy of backing political Islam movements. Russia also entered the fray, reportedly sending the Wagner Group mercenaries to assist Haftar from 2019 onward, seeking a foothold on NATO's southern flank and a share in Libya's oil. Also, perhaps to project power in the Mediterranean. These foreign powers have turned Libya into a proxy battleground similar to Syria, albeit on a smaller scale. NATO's 2011 intervention ironically paved the way for Russia's later intervention. Moscow, aggrieved by NATO's actions, vetoed further UN involvement and instead chose to support its preferred client on the ground. The result was a protracted conflict that drew in foreign drones, missiles, and fighters. By 2020, the Turkish military's direct intervention to save Tripoli's government from Haftar's offensive and Russia's continued backing of Haftar demonstrated how Libya's war had become an international affair. This foreign meddling has made it even harder to resolve Libya's crisis as outside powers continue to arm their proxies despite UN embargoes. So, for the people of Libya who are forced to live through this horrible experience, the question becomes, is Libya better off without Gaddafi? Yes, he was a brutal dictator, one that threatened to kill his own people for rising up against him. But from what we can see now, NATO won the war to remove Gaddafi, but Libya has since lost its future. And if this is what liberation looks like, we really need to rethink what we mean by humanitarian intervention.